August 4, 1940, West Midlands, England. 3 waves of Heinkel 111 bombers from Camp Geschwader 55 unloaded nearly 40 tons of high explosive across a sprawling grass airfield. The bombs cratered runways, obliterated petrol dumps, and reduced 3 Hawker Hurricane fighters to twisted wreckage. German intelligence officers, reviewing reconnaissance photographs hours later, congratulated their crews on a textbook raid against a vital RAF sector station. The actual airfield sat untouched for miles away. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a wartime story. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Every explosion that morning had fallen on empty pasture decorated with wooden airplanes, canvas hangars, and a handful of plywood cows grazing peacefully among the dummy fighters. This wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was precisely what Colonel John Turner had designed 6 months earlier when he'd realized the most effective military deception wasn't about hiding Britain's airfields. It was about building better fake ones. And in that moment captured in those German reconnaissance photographs showing obliterated dummy aircraft and untouched livestock, the Luftwaffe revealed something they would never consciously understand. They weren't just looking at airfields. They were looking at what airfields were supposed to look like. And Britain had learned to show them exactly what they expected to see. The doctrine seemed obvious in 1939. Standard military thinking across every European power emphasized concealment as the foundation of effective camouflage. The Air Ministry's pre-war planning assumed that once hostilities commenced, every operational RAF station would be painted, netted, and disguised to blend into the surrounding countryside. British intelligence officers studied German preparations obsessively, noting how Luftwaffe airfields featured painted runways designed to look like roads or field boundaries from altitude. They documented elaborate artificial landscaping meant to break up geometric patterns, and hangars disguised as farm buildings. The logic appeared unassailable: make your airfields invisible, and the enemy cannot bomb them. German military theorists agreed entirely. Luftwaffe reconnaissance doctrine emphasized systematic photography of suspected military sites, followed by detailed analysis in temperature-controlled rooms far from the front lines. Their intelligence officers received extensive training in identifying airfields through geometric patterns, vehicle movements, and infrastructure signatures. A 1913 Luftwaffe training manual specified 17 distinct recognition features for identifying enemy airfields. The list included runway layouts, dispersal patterns, and the characteristic circular tracks left by aircraft taxiing. The manual made no mention of livestock. Cows were simply irrelevant agricultural noise in military signal. Focusing on such indicators would waste valuable analysis time on civilian installations. The manual's authors never considered that someone might weaponize that blind spot. Colonel John Turner understood what the German analysts could not. Their systematic approach contained a fundamental vulnerability buried in its very thoroughness. German photo analysts were trained to identify military installations by looking for military characteristics to filter signal from noise, to separate the relevant from the irrelevant. Turner realized that the most effective decoy wouldn't try to hide military features. It would instead preserve just enough civilian context to create ambiguity in the analyst's mind. Turner's background gave him a perspective few others possessed. As a Royal Engineer and pilot who'd spent decades designing RAF infrastructure, he understood that military installations exist within civilian landscapes. And in 1940, when the RAF was frantically establishing satellite airfields across Britain, that integration was particularly visible. Real RAF stations requisitioned farmland but didn't always evict farmers. Real dispersal areas featured Spitfires parked next to haystacks. Real airfield commanders dealt constantly with cattle breaking through perimeter fences and wandering onto taxiways. The technical specifications for Case-IT's daytime decoy airfields reflected this philosophy with surgical precision. Each Case-IT required 10 dummy aircraft constructed from canvas stretched over wooden frames, positioned to represent typical dispersal patterns. But Turner's specifications also mandated something unexpected. Each site had to include evidence of civilian occupation, agricultural vehicles, real or dummy, livestock visible in adjacent fields, and crucially, no geometric perfection. Real RAF airfields in 1940 were chaotic places where hurricanes shared field space with cows because farmers still grazed their requisitioned land. The Ministry of Food was demanding maximum agricultural production even as the Ministry of Defense was commandeering farmland for military use. The result was messy, improvised, and absolutely authentic. Turner's decoys replicated that chaos deliberately. At Foul Modeston in Norfolk, protecting the real RAF West Raynham, the decoy site included full-size dummy Blenheim bombers arranged near an actual working farm. The farmer continued raising cattle throughout 1940 and 1941, his dairy herd grazing in fields adjacent to the wooden aircraft. German reconnaissance photographs showed both the bombers and the cows, standard evidence of a hastily established satellite field. The analysts never questioned it. Turner's department, operating from Shepperton Film Studios in Surrey, manufactured decoy elements with Hollywood precision. The dummy aircraft fooled reconnaissance cameras through careful attention to shadow and proportion. Fabric was stretched at specific tensions to create realistic highlights. Paint was weathered deliberately to suggest operational wear. But the livestock decoys served a different purpose entirely. Wooden cow silhouettes were typically 4 to 5 feet long, painted in brown and white patterns, mounted on stakes that allowed them to be moved to different positions. Their crude construction didn't matter because reconnaissance analysts weren't studying the cows. They were using the cows as contextual evidence that ruled out military deception at the subconscious level. The presence of grazing livestock signaled civilian agricultural land, creating cognitive dissonance with any designation as military fakery. A field covered entirely in dummy aircraft looked like a decoy. A field with dummy aircraft and a few cows grazing at the periphery looked like a recently requisitioned farm the RAF was still converting to operational use. Exactly the kind of improvised satellite airfield the British were known to be establishing across rural England in those desperate months. Night decoys employed similar psychology, with even more sophisticated theater. Q sites used electric lighting to simulate RAF airfield operations after dark. They featured T-shaped wind indicators formed from yellow lights, red obstruction lights warning of buildings, and movable car headlamps that operators would taxi along the flare path to represent aircraft movements. But the most sophisticated Q sites also included something unexpected: deliberately accidental lights. A barn window left partially illuminated, the glow from a farmhouse kitchen. Exactly the sort of blackout violations that occurred at real airfields where exhausted crews grew careless. At Lowingstone in Kent, the Q site protecting Biggin Hill included authentic farm buildings whose lights were carefully managed to suggest agricultural workers who didn't quite understand they were near a military installation. That detail, the perfect blackout discipline suggesting civilian confusion, made the deception work. The men who crewed these decoy sites understood something the Luftwaffe's intelligence analysts consistently missed. From 8,000 feet at 250 miles per hour, the defining sign of an active British airfield wasn't the aircraft or the buildings. It was the evidence that ordinary rural life carried on around it. It was the texture of the landscape, the integration of military and civilian elements that characterized Britain's desperate improvisation in 1940. The effectiveness becomes clear when examining Luftwaffe bombing records against documented attacks. On the night of March 18, 1941, during the heaviest raid on Hull up to that point, German bombers dropped more than 200 tons of high explosive on what they believed was Victoria Dock and Alexander Dock. Post-raid reconnaissance confirmed hits on dock infrastructure, warehouse facilities, and what appeared to be moored vessels. The actual docks received minimal damage. The majority of bombs had fallen on Cherry Cobb Sands, a stretch of tidal marsh where Turner's department had constructed dozens of small concrete ponds. Each one reflected moonlight to simulate dock basins. The site included dummy wooden structures representing warehouses. and critically, it was positioned near farmland where cattle grazed during daylight hours. German reconnaissance pilots photographing the area during the day had noted both the dock-like water features and the surrounding agricultural land. They classified it as a working port facility with farmland nearby, exactly the layout of the real Hull docks. The classification stuck. When bombers arrived at night, they saw what they expected to see. The warehouse shapes, the reflected water, the texture of legitimate infrastructure embedded in civilian landscape. Captured Luftwaffe aircrew interrogation reports provide direct evidence of the deception's effectiveness. After a raid on Portsmouth on the night of April 2-3, 1941, a Heinkel crew shot down over the channel stated in their debriefing that they'd bombed dock facilities with surrounding farmland visible in moonlight. They'd actually bombed Common on Hailing Island, a starfish site protecting Portsmouth that absorbed over 500 bomb strikes that night, while Portsmouth itself received only 8. The presence of actual farmland surrounding the decoy site, complete with real cattle, had confirmed to German crews that they were attacking a legitimate naval facility integrated into the coastal landscape. The livestock wasn't camouflage, it was authentication. It told a story. The Germans were predisposed to believe that Britain was converting every available inch of land to military use, that farms and factories and naval bases existed cheek by jowl in desperate improvisation. The statistics compiled by historian Colin Dobinson reveal the pattern with stark clarity. Between June 1940 and December 1941, Q-Site's night decoys received 359 attacks. The real airfields they protected were bombed 358 times. Nearly a 50-50 split, the decoys were drawing roughly half of all raids away from operational stations. K-Site's daytime decoys experienced 30 recorded attacks between June and December 1940. More significantly, Dobinson calculated that approximately 5% of all German bombs dropped on Britain were deflected by decoy sites. That represented potentially 3,160 people spared injury and 2,596 spared death. These weren't just random bombs falling on empty fields. They represented deliberate attacks on targets German intelligence had identified, photographed, and classified as legitimate military installations worth striking. The most telling evidence comes from Luftwaffe tactical reports captured after the war. A German intelligence assessment from August 1941 discussed British airfield dispositions in East Anglia. The report listed 14 RAF stations in Norfolk and Suffolk, providing coordinates, estimated squadron strength, and defensive capabilities for each. 7 of those 14 airfields were K-Site's decoys with dummy aircraft and surrounding farmland that German analysts had catalogued as genuine RAF bases. The report specifically noted that several stations appear to be agricultural facilities converted to military use, with evidence of livestock and farming equipment still present, precisely the impression Turner's department had worked to create. This wasn't theater for theater's sake. It was systematic exploitation of how intelligence analysts create mental models of enemy capabilities. Turner's approach stemmed from a simple insight. German reconnaissance sought military characteristics while filtering out civilian context. British decoys provided military characteristics plus civilian context, creating ambiguity that reconnaissance analysts resolved by classifying the sites legitimate targets rather than elaborate fakes. The framework couldn't process "this looks to civilian to be military, therefore it's a decoy." Instead it processed "this looks civilian and military, therefore it's a newly requisitioned agricultural site converted to military use." The farmers who continued working land surrounding decoy sites often had no idea they were participating in military deception. At Val Modeston, the farmer maintained his dairy herd in fields adjacent to dummy Blenheims, going about his daily routines with no awareness that his cattle were serving as authentication for an elaborate fake. At the Gumber site near Slindon, protecting RAF Tangmere, local agricultural workers went about normal farming routines while RAF personnel operated Q-site lighting from underground bunkers. That genuine civilian activity wasn't incidental. It was the most effective decoy element. impossible for German reconnaissance to distinguish from the countless other farms surrounding real RAF installations. The dummy cows, whether wooden silhouettes, inflatable rubber models, or simply real cattle that happened to graze near decoy installations, represented the final detail that completed the illusion. They weren't military hardware, they were landscape elements that told reconnaissance analysts civilian agricultural land, providing the cognitive frame that made the military element seem like recent additions to an existing rural environment rather than wholesale fabrications on empty fields. A Luftwaffe photo analyst examining images of an East Anglian quayside might notice the dummy hurricanes, the disturbed earth suggesting taxiways, the canvas structures representing hangars. But seeing cows grazing nearby triggered the mental classification requisition farmland, which meant legitimate military site rather than probable decoy. By late 1941, German intelligence had begun identifying some decoy sites through analysis of raid results. When bombs fell on an airfield, but reconnaissance the following day showed no bomb craters because the decoy operators had simply moved the dummy aircraft and repaired any damage to the dirt surface overnight, analysts grew suspicious. The nascent common case protecting RAF Northfield was likely identified as a decoy by December 1940, leading to its closure. But dozens of other decoys continued operating successfully because the Luftwaffe's classification system couldn't overcome its training. Even when analysts suspected deception, they lacked the framework to systematically identify it. The presence of livestock, of agricultural activity, of civilian texture continued to provide authentication. The mental model military installation embedded in requisition farmland remained stronger than any individual suspicion. The wooden bomb legend persists in popular history. RAF crews supposedly dropped wooden bombs on Luftwaffe decoy airfields as mockery, attached to notes reading wood for wood. Historians dispute the story's authenticity. What's documented is that British intelligence identified German decoy installations across occupied Europe and ordered crews to ignore them, wasting no ordnance on worthless targets. That restraint demonstrates the strategic insight Turner understood from the beginning. Once your enemy knows you've identified their decoys, they stop building them. Better to let them waste resources constructing elaborate fakes while you concentrate on destroying real facilities. The silence itself becomes part of the deception, allowing the enemy to believe their deception is working, encouraging them to invest more resources in expanding it. Britain's decoy program ultimately redirected approximately 968 tons of German bombs away from genuine targets onto empty countryside. That figure represents not just explosives, but German planning, navigation, and risk. Bombers flown across the Channel, crews exposed to anti-aircraft fire, fuel consumed, all to crater fields that would be repaired by morning, that existed only to absorb punishment meant for installations from miles away. The real victory wasn't the bombs diverted. It was the strategic uncertainty created. Every German intelligence officer analyzing British airfields now faced an impossible question: was this installation real or fake? That doubt meant raids required more reconnaissance, more analysis, more uncertainty, all of which degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness at the operational level. Bomber crews developed hesitation. Intelligence officers developed caution. The system developed friction. Turner's department produced approximately 400 dummy aircraft between 1940 and 1941. They catalogued 237 Starfish sites by war's end, protecting 81 locations. But the numbers obscure the psychological insight. Effective deception doesn't require perfect replication. It requires exploiting the target's classification system, understanding how they create mental models of reality, then providing information that fits those models while serving your purposes. The dummy cows occupying pastures around Britain's decoy airfields represented more than agricultural props. They were psychological weapons exploiting the gap between systematic military analysis and human pattern recognition. German photo analysts saw airfields with surrounding farmland exactly what they expected to see at requisitioned British installations in 1940. They never questioned whether the farmland itself was part of the deception because their training had taught them to separate military and civilian elements rather than recognizing that in total war, the most effective military installations are those that preserve the texture of civilian life. Turner's genius lay in understanding that the Luftwaffe wasn't looking for decoys, they were looking for airfields. And Britain's decoys covered with fake cows, muddy tracks, and chaotic dispersal patterns that suggested harried ground crews working on requisitioned farmland looked exactly like the improvised, undermanned, desperate RAF installations that German intelligence expected to find across England in 1940. The greatest deception wasn't making fake installations look real. It was making them look exactly as messy, imperfect, and improvised as Britain's actual military preparations. Because in 1940, improvisation and imperfection were real. Every corner of Britain showed the strain of total war. Spitfires did share fields with dairy cattle. Farmers did continue plowing land next to dispersal areas. Blackout discipline was imperfect. Resources were scarce. The landscape showed 1,000 signs of a nation making do with whatever it had. Every dummy hurricane parked next to a wooden cow told German analysts a story they were predisposed to believe. The British were converting farms to airfields as fast as German bombs destroyed them, accepting whatever compromises necessity demanded. It was the story of British desperation that German propaganda had been telling for months, and Britain had learned to make that story physical, to give them the evidence that confirmed their own analysis. The Luftwaffe bombed a fiction instead of a threat. German crews wasted ordnance on plywood buildings and canvas aircraft, while real RAF stations kept hurricanes flying. On August 5, 1940, reconnaissance photos of a West Midlands airfield showed cratered runways, smashed planes, and cows grazing nearby. None were real. The cows were wooden silhouettes, the aircraft were props, and the field was empty pasture. For miles away, the genuine RAF station scrambled fighters. The deception worked because it looked perfectly imperfect, ordinary enough to trust and messy enough to ignore, costing Germany vital bombs and lost chances to hit targets.